Technologies of monstrosity. Bram Stoker's Dracula. Once bitten, twice shy. By way of an introduction to Bram Stoker's Dracula, I want to tell my own story about being consumed and drained by the vampire. Reading Dracula for the first time years ago, I thought I noticed something about vampirism that had been strangely overlooked by critics and readers. Dracula, I thought, with his peculiar physique, his parasitical desires, his aversion to the cross and to all the trappings of Christianity, his blood-sucking attacks, and his avaricious relation to money, resembled stereotypical anti-Semitic 19th century representations of the Jew. Subsequent readings of the novel with attention to the connections in the narrative between blood and gold, race and sex, sexuality and ethnicity confirmed my sense that the anti-Semites Jew and Stoker's vampire bore more than a family resemblance. The connection I had made began to haunt me. I uncovered biographical material and discovered that Stoker was good friends with, and inspired by, Richard Burton, the author of a tract reviving the blood libel against Jews in Damascus. Point 1. I read essays by Stoker in which he railed against degenerate writers for not being good Christians. Point 2. My conclusion seemed sound. The vampire and the Jew were related, and monstrosity in the Gothic novel had much to do with the discourse of modern anti-Semitism. Towards the end of my preliminary research, I came across a fantastic contemporary news piece which reported that the General Mills cereal company was being sued by the Anti-Defamation League because Count Chocula, the children's cereal character, was depicted on one of their cereal boxes wearing a Star of David. 3. While I felt that this incident vindicated my comparison between Jew and vampire, doubts began to creep in about stabilizing this relationship. By the time my doubts had been fully expressed and confirmed by other readers, I discovered that, rather than revealing a hidden agenda in Stoker's novel, I had unwittingly essentialized Jewishness. By equating Jew and vampire in a linear way, I had simply stabilized the relationship between the two as a mirroring, but had left many questions unanswered, indeed unasked, about the production of monstrosity, whether it be monstrous race, monstrous class, monstrous sex. Technologies of monstrosity. Attempts to consume Dracula and vampirism within one interpretive model inevitably produce vampirism. They reproduce, in other words, the very model they claim to have discovered. So, an analysis of the vampire as perverse sexuality runs the risk of merely stabilizing the identity of perversity, its relation to a particular set of traits. The comparison between Jew and vampire still seems interesting and important to me, but for different reasons. I am still fascinated by the inclusion of race or ethnicity in critical interpretations of the novel, but I am not simply attempting now to bring those hidden facets to light. Instead, I want to ask how the Gothic novel and Gothic monsters in particular produce monstrosity as never unitary but always an aggregate of race, class, and gender. I also want to suggest that the 19th century discourse of anti-Semitism and the myth of the vampire share a kind of Gothic economy in their ability to condense many monstrous traits into one body. In the context of this novel, Dracula is otherness itself, a distilled version of all others produced by and within fictional texts, sexual science, and psychopathology. He is monster and man, feminine and powerful, parasitical and wealthy. He is repulsive and fascinating. He exerts the consummate gaze but is scrutinized in all things. He lives forever but can be killed. Dracula is indeed not simply a monster but a technology of monstrosity. Technologies of monstrosity are always also technologies of sex. I want to plug monstrosity and Gothicization into Foucault's great surface network of sexuality, in which the stimulation of bodies, the intensification of pleasures, the incitement to discourse, the formation of special knowledges, the strengthening of controls and resistances are linked to one another in accordance with a few major strategies of knowledge and power. For although Foucault does not talk about the novel as one of these major strategies of knowledge and power, the Gothic novel in my discussion will represent a privileged field in the network of sexuality. The novel, indeed, is the discursive arena in which identity is constructed as sexual identity. The novel transforms metaphors of otherness into technologies of sex, into machinic texts, in other words, that produce perverse identities. 5. Foucault identifies the figures of the hysterical woman, the masturbating child, the malfusion couple, and the perverse adult as inventions of sexist technology. The vampire Dracula represents all of these figures. He economically condenses their sexual threat into one body, a body that is noticeably feminized, wildly fertile, and seductively perverse. For Dracula is the deviant or the criminal, the other against whom the normal and the lawful, the marriageable, and the heterosexual can be known and quantified. Dracula creeps face down along the wall of the very fortress of identity. He is the boundary, he is the one who crosses. Transylvania equals across the woods, and the one who knows the other side. But the otherness that Dracula embodies is not timeless or universal, not the opposite of some commonly understood meaning of the human. The others that Dracula has absorbed and who live on in him take on the historically specific contours of race, class, gender, and sexuality. They are the other side of a national identity that, in the 1890s, coincided with the hegemonic ideal of bourgeois Victorian womanhood. Mina and Lucy, the dark and the fair heroines of Stoker's novel, make Englishness a function of quiet femininity and maternal domesticity. Dracula, accordingly, threatens the stability and, indeed, the naturalness of this equation between middle-class womanhood and national pride by seducing both women with his particularly foreign sexuality. Point 6. To claim that Dracula's sexuality is foreign, however, is to already obscure the specific construction of a native sexuality. Lucy, as many critics have noted, is violently punished for her desire for 3 men, and all 3 eventually participate in a ritual staking of her vampiric body. Mina represents a maternal sexuality as she nurtures and caters to the brave Englishmen who are fighting for her honor and her body. The foreign sexuality that confronts these women, then, depends upon a burgeoning definition of normal versus pathological sexual function, which itself depends upon naturalizing the native. It is part of the power of Dracula that Stoker merges pathological sexuality with foreign aspect and, as we shall see with reference to the insane Renfield, psychopathology. The vampire Dracula, in other words, is a composite of otherness that manifests as the horror essential to dark, foreign, and perverse bodies. Dracula the text, like Dracula the monster, is multivalent and generates myriad interpretive narratives which attempt to classify the threat of the vampire as sexual or psychological, as class-bound or gendered. The technology of the vampire's monstrosity, indeed, is intimately connected to the mode of the novel's production. Dracula is a veritable writing machine constructed out of diaries, letters, newspaper clippings, and medical case notes. The process of compilation is similarly complex. Mina Harker, as secretary, makes a narrative of the various documents by chronologically ordering them and, where necessary, transcribing notes from a primitive dictaphone. There is a marked sexual energy to the reading and writing of all the contributions to the narrative. Reading, for instance, unites the men and Mina in a safe and mutual bond of disclosure and confidence. After Mina listens to Dr. Seward's phonograph recording of his account of Lucy's death, she assures him, "I have copied out the words on my typewriter, and none other need now hear your heartbeat as one did." 7. Seward, in his turn, reads Harker's diary and notes, after reading his account. One was prepared to meet a good specimen of manhood. 237. Later, Seward passes by the Harkes' bedroom and on hearing the click of the typewriter he concludes, they were hard-headed. 237. Writing and reading, on some level, appear to provide a safe textual alternative to the sexuality of the vampire. They also, of course, produce the vampire as the truth of textual labor. He is a thread which must be diffused by discourse. 8. The novel presents a body of work to which, it is important to note, only certain characters contribute. The narrative episodes are tape-recorded, transcribed, added to, edited, and compiled by 4 characters. Jonathan Harker, Dr. Seward, Mina Harker, and Lucy Westenthal. The control of the narrative by these characters suggests that the textual body, for Stoker, like the bodies of the women of England, must be protected from any corrupting or foreign influence. Van Helsing, Lord Godalming, Quincy Morris, Renfield, and Dracula have only recorded voices in the narrative. At no time do we read their own accounts of events. 3 of these men, of course, are foreigners. Van Helsing is Dutch, Quincy Morris is American, and Dracula is East European. Lord Godalming, we assume, has English blood but as an aristocrat. He is of a different class than the novel's narrators. Renfield, of course, has been classified as insane and his subjective existence is always a representation by Dr. Seward. The activities of reading and writing, then, are crucial in this novel to the establishment of a kind of middle-class hegemony, and they are next to the productions of sexual subjectivities. Sexuality, however, is revealed in the novel to be mass-produced rather than essential to certain kinds of bodies, a completely controlled production of a group of professionals, doctors, psychiatrists, lawyers. Writing, or at least who writes, must be controlled since it represents the deployment of knowledge and power. Similarly, reading may need to be authorized and censored, as indeed it is later in the novel when Mina begins to fall under the vampire's influence. The vampire can read Mina's mind and so Mina is barred from reading the English group's plans. Dracula's reading and Mina's reading are here coded as corrupt and dangerous. Similarly, the Englishmen censor Dracula's contaminated opinions out of the narrative. The vampire, indeed, has no voice. He is read and written by all the other characters in the novel. Dracula's silence in the novel, his only speeches or recorded conversations with Jonathan Harker, is pervasive and almost suffocating, and it actually creates the vampire as fetish since, in so much of the narrative, writing takes on a kind of sexual function. By examining Stoker's novel as a machine text, then, a text that generates particular subjectivities, we can atomize the totality of the vampire's monstrosity, examine the exact nature of his parasitism, and make an assault upon the naturalness of the sexuality of his enemies. By reading Dracula as a technology of monstrosity, I am claiming a kind of productivity for the text, a productivity which leads to numerous avenues of interpretation. But this does not mean that monstrosity in this novel is constantly in motion. Every now and then it settles into a distinct form, a proper shape, and in those moments Dracula's features are eminently readable and suggestive. Dracula is likened to mist, to a red cloud, to a ghost or a shadow until he is invited into the home, at which point he becomes solid and fleshly. As flesh and blood, the vampire embodies a particular ethnicity and a peculiar sexuality. Gothic anti-Semitism, degeneracy. Gothic anti-Semitism makes the Jew a monster with bad blood, and it defines monstrosity as a mixture of bad blood, unstable gender identity, sexual and economic parasitism, and degeneracy. In this section I want to flesh out my premise that the vampire, as represented by Bram Stoker, bears some relation to the anti-Semite Jew. If this is so, it tells us nothing about Jews but everything about anti-Semitic discourse, which seems able to transform all thread into the thread embodied by the Jew. The monster Jew produced by 19th century anti-Semitism represents fears about race, class, gender, sexuality, and empire. This figure is indeed Gothicized or transformed into an all-purpose monster. By making a connection between Stoker's Gothic fiction and late 19th century anti-Semitism, I am not claiming a deliberate and unitary relation between fictional monster and real Jew. Rather, I am attempting to make an argument about the process of othering. Othering in Gothic fiction scavenges from many discursive fields and makes monsters out of bits and pieces of science and literature. The reason Gothic monsters are overdetermined, which is to say, open to numerous interpretations, is precisely because monsters transform the fragments of otherness into one body. That body is not female, not Jewish, not homosexual, but it bears the marks of the constructions of femininity, race, and sexuality. Dracula, then, resembles the Jew of anti-Semitic discourse in several ways: his appearance, his relation to money/gold, his parasitism, his degeneracy, his impermanence or lack of allegiance to a fatherland, and his femininity. Dracula's physical aspect, his physiognomy, is a particularly clear cipher for the specificity of his ethnic monstrosity. When Jonathan Harker meets the Count on his visit to Castle Dracula in Transylvania, he describes Dracula in terms of a very marked physiognomy. He notes an aquiline nose with peculiarly arched nostrils, massive eyebrows and bushy hair, a cruel mouth and peculiarly sharp white teeth, pale ears which were extremely pointed at the top, and a general aspect of extraordinary pallor. 18. This description of Dracula, however, changes at various points in the novel. When he is spotted in London by Jonathan and Mina, Dracula is a tall thin man with a beaky nose and black mustache and pointed beard. 180. Similarly, the zookeeper whose wolf disappears after Dracula's visit to the zoological gardens describes the Count as a tall thin chap with a okay nose and a pointed beard. 145. Most descriptions include Dracula's hard, cold look and his red eyes. Visually, the connection between Dracula and other fictional Jews is quite strong. For example, George du Maurier's Svengali, the Jewish hypnotist, is depicted as a stick, haunting, long, lean, uncanny, black spider cat with brown teeth and matted hair and, of course, incredibly piercing eyes. Fagin, the notorious villain of Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist, also has matted hair and a villainous-looking and repulsive face. While Dracula's hands have hairs in the center of the palm and long, pointed nails, Fagin's hand is a withered old claw. Edouard Drumont, a French National Socialist who, during the 1880s, called for the expulsion of the Jews from France in his newspaper Libre Parole, noted the identifying characteristics of the Jew as the hooked nose, shifty eyes, protruding ears, elongated body, flat feet, and moist hands. 9. Faces and bodies, in fact, mark the other as evil so that he can be recognized and ostracized. Furthermore, the face in the 19th century which supposedly expressed Jewishness, hook nose, shifty eyes, etc., is also seen to express 19th century criminality and degeneration within the pseudosciences of physiognomy and phrenology. Low degeneration and Jewishness, one could therefore conclude, or, indeed, ratify scientifically, were not far apart. Stoker draws upon the relation between degeneration and physiognomy as theorized by Cesare Lombroso and Max Anwar for his portrayal of Dracula. Towards the end of Dracula, as Van Helsing, the Dutch doctor slash lawyer leads Harker, Lord Godalming, Dr. Seward, and the American, Quincy Morris, in the final pursuit of the vampire. A discussion of criminal types ensues between Van Helsing, Seward, and Harker's wife, Mina. Van Helsing defines Dracula as a criminal with a child brain, predestined to crime, 361. And Van Helsing struggles to articulate his ideas in his broken English. He turns to Mina for help. Mina translates for him succinctly, and she even adds sources for the theory Van Helsing has advanced. The Count is a criminal and of criminal type. Anwar and Lombroso would so classify him, and qua criminal he is of imperfectly formed mind, 361. Since Mina, the provincial school teacher, mentions Lombroso and Anwar, we may conclude that their ideas of criminality and degeneracy were familiar to an educated readership rather than specialized medical knowledge. And Mina points out, Lombroso would attribute Dracula's criminal disposition to an imperfectly formed mind, or, in other words, to what Van Helsing calls a child brain. Lombroso noted similarities between the physiognomies of criminals, savages and apes, and concluded that degenerates were a biological throwback to primitive man. Criminal anthropology, quite obviously, as it developed in the 19th century, focuses upon the visual aspects of pathology. The attempt to catalog and demonstrate a propensity for degenerative behavior by reading bodies and faces demands that, in racial stereotyping, stereotypes be visualizable. And racial degeneracy, with its close ties to a social Darwinist conception of human development, also connects with sexual degeneracy. In describing the medicalization of sex, Michel Foucault describes a progressive logic in which perversion, hereditary, and generescence 12 become the basis of 19th century scientific claims about the danger of undisciplined sexuality. Sexual perversions, within this chain, arise out of inherited physical weaknesses, and they potentially lead to the decline of future generations. Furthermore, theorizing degenerescence or degeneration as the result of hereditary perversion takes, he claims, the coherent form of a state-directed racism. 119. Elsewhere, Foucault claims that modern anti-Semitism developed, in socialist milieux, out of the theory of degeneracy. And this statement, surprisingly, occurs during a discussion of vampire novels of the 19th century. Foucault is being interviewed by Alain Gros-Richard, Guy L. Goffey, and Jacques-Alain Miller when the subject of vampires arises out of a discussion of the nobility and what Foucault calls the myth of blood. In relating blood as symbolic object to the development of racial doctrines of degeneracy and heredity, Foucault suggests that the scientific ideology of race was developed by the left rather than by right-wing fanatics. Lombroso, for example, he points out, was a man of the left. The discussion goes as follows. L. E. Goffey, couldn't one see a confirmation of what you are saying in the 19th century book for vampire novels, in which the aristocracy is always presented as the beast to be destroyed? The vampire is always the aristocrat and the savior of bourgeois. Foucault, in the 18th century, rumors were already circulating that debauched aristocrats abducted little children to slaughter them and regenerate themselves by bathing in their blood. The rumors even led to riots. L. E. Goffey again emphasizes that this theme develops as a bourgeois myth of that class's overthrow of the aristocracy. Foucault responds, modern anti-Semitism began in that form. 13. I have described this discussion at length to show how one might begin to theorize the shift within the Gothic novel that transforms the thread of the aristocrat into the thread of the degenerate foreigner, the thread of money into the thread of blood. The bad blood of family, in other words, is replaced by the bad blood of race, and the scientific theory of degeneracy produces and explains this transition. While neither L. E. Goffey nor Foucault attempts to determine what the role of the Gothic novel was in producing these new categories of identity, I have been arguing that Gothic fiction creates the narrative structure for all kinds of Gothicizations across disciplinary and ideological boundaries. Gothic describes a discursive strategy which produces monsters as a kind of temporary but influential response to social, political, and sexual problems. And yet, Gothic, as I have noted, always goes both ways. So, even as Gothic style creates the monster, it calls attention to the plasticity or constructed nature of the monster and, therefore, calls into question all scientific and rational attempts to classify and quantify agents of disorder. Such agents, Gothic literature makes clear, are invented, not covered by science. Gothic anti-Semitism, 2. Jewish bodies/Jewish neuroses. I am calling modern anti-Semitism Gothic because, in its various forms, medical, political, psychological, it, too, unites and therefore produces the threads of capital and revolution, criminality and impotence, sexual power and gender ambiguity, money and mind within an identifiable form, the body of the Jew. In The Jew's Body, Sander Gilman demonstrates how 19th century anti-Semitism replaced religious anti-Judaism with the pseudo-scientific construction of the Jewish body as an essentially criminalized and pathologized body. He writes, the very analysis of the nature of the Jewish body, in the broader culture or within the culture of medicine, has always been linked to establishing the difference, and dangerousness, of the Jew. This scientific vision of parallel and unequal races is part of the polygenetic argument about the definition of race within the scientific culture of the 18th century. In the 19th century it is more strongly linked to the idea that some races are inherently weaker, degenerate more at risk for diseases than others. 14. In Dracula, vampires are precisely a race and a family that weakens the stock of Englishness by passing on degeneracy and the disease of bloodlust. Dracula, as a monster/master parasite, feeds upon English wealth and health. He sucks blood and drains resources, he always eats out. Jonathan Harker describes the horror of finding the vampire sated in his coffin after a good night's feed. His cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on the lips were gouts of fresh blood, which trickled from the corners of the mouth and ran over the chin and neck. Even the deep, burning eyes seemed set amongst the swollen flesh, for the lids and pouches underneath were bloated. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion. 54. The health of the vampire, of course, his full cheeks and glowing skin, comes at the expense of the women and children he has vamped. Harker is disgusted not simply by the spectacle of the vampire but also by the thought that when the Count arrives in England he will want to satiate his lust for blood, and create a new and ever-widening circle of demons to batten on the helpless. 54. At this juncture Harker picks up a shovel and attempts to beat the vampire/monster into pulp. The fear of a mob of parasites feeding upon the social body drives Harker to violence because the parasite represents the idle and dependent other, an organism that lives to feed and feeds to live. 15. Dracula is surrounded by the odor of awful decay as though, as Harker puts it, corruption had become itself corrupt. 265. When Harker and his band of friends break into Carfax, Dracula's London home, they are all nauseated by a smell composed of all the ills of mortality and with the pungent, acrid smell of blood. 265. Similarly, a worker who delivered Dracula's coffins to Carfax tells Seward that Eru's governor is the rummiest I ever was in. Blame. The place was that neglected that you might obviously smell old Jerusalem in it. 240. The worker is quite specific here. To him the smell is a Jewish smell. Like the diseases attributed to the Jews as a race, bodily odors, people assumed just clung to them and marked them out as different and, indeed, repeat. And objects of pollution. 16. Parasitism was linked specifically to Jewishness in the I-890s via a number of discourses. In business practices in London's East End, Jews were vilified as middlemen who lived off the physical labor of English working-class bodies. 17. Jews were also linked to the spread of syphilis, to the pseudo-scientific discourse of degeneration, and to an inherent criminality that could be verified by phrenological experiments. The Jewish body, in other words, was constructed as parasite, as the difference within, as unhealthy dependence, as a corruption of spirit that reveals itself upon the flesh. Obviously, the repugnant, horror-generating, disease-riddled body of the vampire bears great resemblance to the anti-Semite Jewish body described by Gilman as a construction of the 19th century culture of medicine. But the Jewish body does not only bear the burden of a scientific discussion of race. In his incarnations as vampire and madman, the Jew also produces race as a psychological category. Race, in other words, may manifest itself as an inherent tendency towards neurosis, hysteria, or other so-called psychological disturbances. While this may seem completely in keeping with the larger motives of 19th century race ideology, the division of humanity into distinct groups, the psychologization of race has, in fact, particularly insidious effects. It obscures the political agenda of racism by masquerading as objective description and by essentializing Jewishness in relation to particular kinds of bodies, behaviors, and sexualities. Dracula's blood bond with the insane Renfield provides a particularly powerful link between his character, the racial and psychological stereotypes of Jews, and Gothic anti-Semitism. Seward's interactions with the insane Renfield fulfill a strange function in the novel, while, one assumes, Renfield should further demarcate the distance between normal and pathological. In fact, Seward constantly compares himself to his patient. Am I to take it, pondered Seward, that I have anything in common with him, so that we are, as it were, to stand together? 114. Renfield's frequent violent outbursts and his habit of eating insects convinces Seward, temporarily at least, that Renfield's insanity resembles rationality only by chance. Renfield's obsessive behavior involves trapping flies to feed to spiders and spiders to feed to birds. Renfield then consumes the birds. Having observed the development of this activity, Seward decides, I shall have to invent a new classification for him, and call him a zoophagous, life-eating, maniac. What he desires is to absorb as many lives as he can, and he has laid himself out to achieve it in a cumulative way. 75. Zoophagous, of course, is a term that may just as easily be applied to Dracula, and so, the diagnosis made by Seward on Renfield connects the pathology of one to the other. In The Madman as Artist, Medicine, History, and Degenerate, Sander Gilman shows how 19th century sexologists marked the Jews as particularly prone to insanity, arguing that the race was inherently degenerate and that degeneration was perpetuated by inbreeding, craft-eating, and Charcot, among others, suggested that, in Gilman's words, Jews go crazy because they act like Jews. 18. We may apply this dictum to Dracula with interesting results. Renfield is viewed as crazy when he acts like Dracula, when he feeds upon other lives, and Dracula is implicitly insane because his actions are identical to those that keep Renfield in the asylum. Vampirism and its psychotic form of autophagy, in Stoker's novel, both make a pathology out of threats to rationality made by means of excessive consumption and its relation to particular social and sexual habits. The asylum and Carfax, therefore, the homes of madman and vampire, sit in the heart of London as disciplinary icons, reminders to the reader of the consequences of overconsumption. In several of his famous Tuesday lessons at Salpatryra, Dr. Jean Martin Charcot commented upon the hereditary disposition of the Jews to certain nervous diseases like hysteria. Jewish families, he remarked, during a study of facial paralysis, furnish us with the finest subjects for the study of hereditary nervous disease. 19. In an article on psychiatric anti-Semitism in France at the turn of the century, Jan Goldstein analyzes interpretations of the Jews within the human sciences to show how supposedly disinterested and objective studies fed upon and into anti-Semitism. Charcot's pronouncements on the Jews and hereditary nervous disease, for example, were often used by anti-Semites to prove the degeneracy of that race. Similarly, Charcot's work on ambulatory automatism was used by his student Henry Mage to connect the Jews, via the myth of the wandering Jew, with a particular form of epilepsy which induced prolonged somnambulism in the subject. Goldstein writes, the restless wanderings of the Jews, Mage seemed to say, had not been caused supernaturally, as punishment for their role as Christ killers, but rather naturally, by their strong propensity to nervous illness. The Jews were not so much an envious people as a constitutionally defective one. 20. The pathology of the Jews, according to anti-Semitism, involved an absence of allegiance to a fatherland, a propensity for economic opportunism, and therefore, a lack of social morality and, in general, a kind of morbid narcissism or selfishness. Dracula's need to consume as many lives as he can is feminized because non-phallic sexuality, and his ambulism that causes him to wander far from home in search of new blood mark him with all the signs of a Jewish neurosis. Dracula, as the prototype of the wanderer, the stranger in a strange land, also reflects the way that homelessness or rootlessness was seen to undermine nation. The threat posed by the wanderer within the novel, furthermore, is dearly identified by Stoker as a sexual threat. The Nosferatu is not simply a standard reincarnation of Gothic's wandering Jew but rather an undead body, a body that will not rest until it has feasted upon the vital fluids of women and children, drained them of health, and seduced them into a growing legion of perverts and parasites. In his essay The Uncanny, Freud writes about the roots of the uncanny and the lack of place. 21. He goes on to reveal the mother's genitalia as a primal uncanny place, a place of lack, a site that generates fear and familiarity. Being buried alive, Freud suggests, appears in fiction as the most uncanny thing of all, but this fear simply transforms a more pleasurable and familiar fantasy, that of intrauterine existence. 151. The uncanny aspect of the vampire, however, is not reducible to an edible scene because home in the I-890s was precisely an issue resonating with cultural and political implications. Coming or going home, finding a home, was not simply a compulsive return to the womb, it involved nationalist, imperialist, and colonialist enterprises. Point 22 Dracula, of course, has no home and wants no home. He carries his coffins, his only permanent resting place, with him and nests briefly but fruitfully in populated areas. Home, with its connotations of marriage, monogamy, and community, is precisely what Dracula is in exile from and precisely what would and does kill him in the end. His enemies seek to entrap and confine him, to keep him in one place separate from the native population. Mina Harker, the epitome, in the novel, of all that is good in woman, tells Seward that they must rid the earth of this terrible monster, 235, and Van Helsing pronounces Dracula abhorred by all, a blot in the face of God's sunshine, an arrow in the side of him who died for man, 25I. Dracula, like the Jew, and the Jew, like the vampire, is not only parasitical upon the community's health and wealth, he is sick, nervous, a representation of the way that an unbalanced mind was supposed to produce behavior at cross purposes with nation, home, and healthful reproduction. The relation between Renfield and the vampire suggests that vampirism is, itself, a psychological disorder, an addictive activity which, in Renfield's case, can be corrected in the asylum but which, in Dracula's case, requires permanent exile or the permanent confinement of the grave. The equation of vampirism with insanity implies an essential connection between progressive degeneracy, hereditary perversion, and a gothic science fiction of race. Gothic sexuality, the vampire sex. Dracula's racial markings are difficult to distinguish from his sexual markings. Critics, indeed, have repeatedly discussed vampiric sexuality to the exclusion of race or the vampire's foreignness as merely a function of his strange sexuality. Point 23 One critic, Sue Ellen Case, has attempted to locate the vampire within the tangle of race and sexuality. She is interested in the vampire in the 19th century as a lesbian vampire and as a markedly queer and outlawed body. She also connects the bloodlust of the vampire to the history of anti-Semitism, and she opposes both lesbian and Jew within the vampiric form to a reproductive or maternal sexuality. Case describes the vampire as the double she in combination with the queer fanged creature. The vampire is the queer in its lesbian mode. 24. Of course, vampiric sexuality as it appears in Dracula has also been described as homoerotic. 25 and as heterosexual exogamy. Point 26 So which is it? Of course it is all of these and more. The vampire is not lesbian, homosexual, or heterosexual, the vampire represents the productions of sexuality itself. The vampire, after all, creates more vampires by engaging in a sexual relation with his victims, and he produces vampires who share his specific sexual predilections. So the point really is not to figure out which so-called perverse sexuality Dracula or the vampire in general embodies, rather we should identify the mechanism by which the consuming monster who reproduces his own image comes to represent the construction of sexuality itself. Vampiric sexuality blends power and femininity within the same body and then marks that body as distinctly alien. Dracula is a perverse and multiple figure because he transforms pure and virginal women into seductresses. He produces sexuality through their willing bodies. Lucy and Mina's transformation stress an urgent sexual appetite. The three women who ambush Harker in the castle Dracula display similar voracity. Both Lucy and Dracula's women feed upon children. As Nosferatu, buried and yet undead, Lucy walks the heath as the blubber lady who lures children to her and then sucks their blood. This act represents the exact reversal of a mother's nurturance. Crouching outside her tomb, Harker and his friends watch horrified as Lucy arrives fresh from the hunt. With a careless motion, notes Seward, she flung to the ground, callous as a devil, the child that up to now she had clutched strenuously to her breast, growling over it as a dog growls over a bone. 223. Lucy is now no longer recognizable as the virginal Englishwoman engaged to marry Lord Godalming, and the group takes a certain sexual delight in staking her body, decapitating her, and stuffing her mouth with garlic. Point 27 When Mina Harker falls under Dracula's spell, he inverts her maternal impulse, and the woman who, by day, nurtures all the men around her, by night, drinks blood from the bosom of the king vampire himself. Her white night dress was smeared with blood and a thin stream trickled down the man's bare breast, which was shown by his torn open dress. 298. Apart from the obvious reversal of Mina's maternal role, this powerful image feminizes Dracula in relation to his sexuality. It is eminently notable, then, that male, not female, vampires reproduce. Lucy and the three female vampires in Transylvania feed from children but do not create vampire children. Dracula alone reproduces his form. Dracula, of course, also produces male sexuality in this novel as a composite of virility, good blood, and the desire to reproduce one's own kind. Male sexuality in this respect is a vampiric sexuality, and here I diverge from Case's claim for vampirism as lesbianism. As critics have noted, the birth of an heir at the novel's conclusion, a baby boy named after all the men who fought for his mother's virtue, signifies a culmination of the transfusion scene when all the men give blood to Lucy's depleted body. Dracula has drunk from Lucy and Mina has drunk from Dracula, so paternity by implication is shared and multiple. Little Quincy's many fathers are the happy alternative to the threat of many mothers, all the blubber ladies who might descend upon children at night and suck from them instead of suckling them. Men, not women, within the system reproduce, the female body is rendered non-productive by its sexuality and the vampiric body is distinguished from the English male bodies by its femininity. Blood circulates throughout vampiric sexuality as a substitute or metaphor for other bodily fluids, milk, semen, and once again, the leap between bad blood and perverse sexuality, as Case points out, is not hard to make. Dracula's sexuality makes sexuality itself a construction within a signifying chain of class, race, and gender. Gothic sexuality, furthermore, manifests itself as a kind of technology, a productive force which transforms the blood of the native into the lust of the other, and as an economy which unites the thread of the foreign and perverse within a single monstrous body. Gothic economies. The Gothic economy may be described in terms of a thrifty metaphoricity, one which, rather than simply scapegoating, constructs a monster out of the traits which ideologies of race, class, gender, sexuality, and capital want to disavow. The Gothic economy also complies with what we might call the logic of capitalism, a logic which rationalizes even the most supernatural of images into material images of capitalism itself. To take a remarkable image from Dracula as an example, readers may recall the scene in Transylvania at Castle Dracula when Jonathan Harker, searching for a way out, stumbles upon a pile of gold. The only thing I found was a great heap of gold in one corner, gold of all kinds, Roman, and British, and Austrian, and Hungarian, and Greek and Turkish money, covered with a film of dust, as though it had lain long in the ground. None of it that I noticed was less than 300 years old. There were also chains and ornaments, some jeweled, but all of them old and stained. 49. This image of the dusty and unused gold, coins from many nations, and old unworn jewels immediately connects Dracula to the old money of a corrupt class, to a kind of piracy of nations, and to the worst excesses of the aristocracy. Dracula lets his plundered wealth rot. He does not circulate his capital, he only takes and never spends. Of course, this is exactly the method of his vampirism. Dracula drains, but it is the band of Englishmen and Van Helsing who must restore. I call this an instance of Gothic economy because the pile of gold both makes Dracula monstrous in his relation to money and produces an image of monstrous anti-capitalism, one distinctly associated with vampirism. Money, the novel suggests, should be used and circulated, and vampirism somehow interferes with the natural ebb and flow of currency just as it literally intervenes in the ebbing and flowing of blood. Marx himself emphasized the Gothic nature of capitalism, its investment in Gothic economies of signification, by deploying the metaphor of the vampire to characterize the capitalist. In the First International, Marx writes, British industry, vampire-like, could but live by sucking blood, and children's blood too. The modern world for Marx is peopled with the undead. It is indeed a Gothic world haunted by specters and ruled by the mystical nature of capital. He writes in Grundriss, capital posits the permanence of value, to a certain degree, by incarnating itself in fleeting commodities and taking on their form, but at the same time changing them just as constantly. But capital obtains this ability only by constantly sucking in living labor as its soul, vampire-like. 28 While it is fascinating to note the coincidence here between Marx's description of capital and the power of the vampire, it is not enough to say that Marx uses Gothic metaphors. Marx, in fact, is describing an economic system, capitalism, which is positively Gothic in its ability to transform matter into commodity, commodity into value, and value into capitalism. And Gothic capitalism, like the vampire, functions through many different, even contradictory, technologies. Indeed, as Terry Lovell points out in Consuming Fiction, capitalism demands contradiction and it predicates a radically split, self-contradictory subject. The capitalist subject is both a unified subject who inhabits a sober, predictable world and has a stable self-identity and a self open to infatuation with the wares of the capitalist marketplace. 29 The 19th century novel, Lovell claims, is deeply implicated in this fracture within capitalism's imaginary selves. 16. Obviously, the imaginary selves of the vampire and its victims exemplify fractured and contradictory subjectivities. Both vampire and victim are figured repeatedly in desiring relations to both production, as riders and breeders, and consumption, as readers and prey. Vampirism, Franco Moretti claims, is an excellent example of the identity of fear and desire. 30 2. Points to the radical ambivalence embodied within the Gothic novel and to the economy of metaphoricity within Gothic monstrosity. For Moretti, Frankenstein's monster and Dracula are totalizing monsters who embody the worker and capital, respectively. Dracula is gold brought to life and animated within monopoly capitalism. He is, as we have discussed, dead labor as described by Marx. While Moretti finds Dracula's metaphoric force to be inextricably bound to capital, he acknowledges that desire unravels and then confuses the neat analogy. The vampire represents money, old and new, but he also releases a sexual response that threatens bourgeois culture precisely from below. As with Frankenstein's monster, Dracula's designs upon civilization are read by his enemies as the desire to father a new race. Parker fears that Dracula will create a new and ever-widening circle of demons to batten on the helpless. 54. More than simply an economic threat, then, Dracula's attack seems to come from all sides, from above and below. He is money, he is vermin, he is the triumph of capital and the threat of revolution. Parker and his cronies create in Dracula an image of aristocratic tyranny, of corrupt power and privilege, of foreign threat in order to characterize their own cause as just, patriotic, and even revolutionary. In one interaction between Harker's band of men and the vampire, the Gothic economy that Dracula embodies is forcefully literalized. Having broken into Dracula's house, the men are surprised by Dracula's return. In the interaction that follows, the vampire is turned into the criminal or interloper in his own home. Harker slashes at him with a knife, a second less and the blade had shorn through his heart. As it was, the point just cut the cloth of his coat, making a wide gap whence a bundle of banknotes and a stream of gold fell out. 323-24. Dracula is then driven back by Harker, who holds up a crucifix, and forced out of the window but not before he swept under Harker's arm in order to grasp a handful of the money from the floor. Dracula now makes his escape. Amid the crash and glitter of the falling glass, he tumbled into the flagged area below. Through the sound of the shivering glass I could hear the ting of the gold, as some of the sovereigns fell on the flagging. 324. This incident is overdetermined to say the least. The creature who lives on a diet of blood bleeds gold when wounded. At a time of critical danger, the vampire grovels upon the floor for money, and then his departure is tracked by the ting of the coins that he drops during his flight. Obviously, the metaphoric import of this incident is to make literal the connection between blood and money and to identify Harker's band with a different and more mediated relation to gold. Harker and his cronies use money and they use it to protect their women and their country. Dracula hoards gold and he uses it only to attack and seduce. But there is still more at stake in this scene. The Gothic economy, I suggested, may be identified by the thriftiness of metaphor. So, the image of the vampire bleeding gold connects not only to Dracula's abuses of capital, his avarice with money, and his excessive sexuality, it also identifies Dracula within the racial chain of signification that, as I have shown, links vampirism to anti-Semitic representations of Jewishness. The scene vividly resonates with Shylock's famous speech in The Merchant of Venice, I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, heard with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, if you prick us do we not bleed? If you tickle us do we not laugh? If you poison us do we not die? And if you wrong us shall we not revenge? 3. Bram Stoker was stage manager for the 250 performances of The Merchant of Venice in which Henry Irving, his employer, played Shylock, and so it is not so strange to find echoes of Shakespeare's quintessential outsider in Stoker's Dracula. But Stoker epitomizes the differences between Dracula and his persecutors in the very terms that Shylock claims as common ground. Dracula's eyes and hands, his sense and passions are patently alien. He does not eat the same food, he is not hurt by the same weapons or infected by the same diseases, and when he is wounded, pricked, he does not bleed, he sheds gold. In the character of Dracula, Stoker has inverted the Jew's defense into a damning testimony of otherness. 31 The traditional portrayal of the Jew as usurer or banker, as a parasite who uses money to make money, suggests the economic base of anti-Semitism and the relation between the anti-Semite's monster Jew and Dracula. I have shown that the Jew and the vampire, within a certain politics of monstrosity, are both degenerate, they both represent parasitical sexuality and economy, they both unite blood and gold in what is feared to be a conspiracy against nationhood. We might interpret Moretti's claim that the vampire is a totalizing monster in light of the Gothic economy which allows Dracula to literalize an anti-capitalist, an exemplary consumer, and the anti-Semite's Jew. With regard to the latter category, Dracula is foreignness itself. Like the Jew, its function within a Gothic economy is to be all difference to all people, its horror cannot and must not be pinned down exactly. Marx's equation of vampire and capital and Moretti's analysis of Dracula and gold must be questioned in terms of the metaphoricity of the monster. As Moretti rightly points out, in the literature of terror the metaphor is no longer a metaphor, it is a character as real as the others. 106. Gothic, indeed, charts the transformation of metaphor into body, of fear into form, of narrative into currency. Dracula is, rather than represents, gold, its body bleeds gold, it stinks of corruption, and it circulates within many discourses as a currency of monstrosity. The vampire's sexuality and its power, its erotic and economic attraction, are Gothic in their ability to transform multiple modes of signification into one image, one body, one monster, a totality of horror. Biting back. The technology of Dracula gothicizes certain bodies by making monstrosity an essential component of a race, a class, or a gender or some hybrid of all of these. I have tried to show that Gothicization, while it emerges in its most multiple and overt form in the Gothic novel, is a generic feature of many 19th century human sciences and ideologies. Gothic economies produce monstrous capitalist practice, Gothic. Anti-Semitism fixes all difference in the body of the Jew, and Gothic fiction produces monstrosity as a technology of sexuality, identity, and narrative. But I have also tried to make the case for the productivity of the Gothic fiction. Rather than simply demonizing and making monstrous a unitary other, Gothic is constantly in motion. The appeal of the Gothic text, then, partly lies in its uncanny power to reveal the mechanisms of monster production. The monster, in its otherworldly form, its supernatural shape, wears the traces of its own construction. Like the bolt through the neck of Frankenstein's monster in the modern horror film, the technology of monstrosity is written upon the body. And the artificiality of the monster denaturalizes in turn the humanness of its enemies. 32. Dracula, in particular, concerns itself with modes of production and consumption, with the proximity of the normal and the pathological, the native and the foreign. Even though, by the end of the novel, the vampire is finally staked, the monster is driven out of England and laid to rest, even though monogamous heterosexuality appears to triumph in the birth of Quincy Harker, the body is as much the son of Dracula as he is of the little band of men, 400, after whom he is named. Blood has been mixed after all and, like the mass of material which tells the story of the vampire but contains hardly one authentic document, Quincy is hardly the authentic reproduction of his parents. Monster, in fact, merges with man by the novel's end and the boy reincarnates the dead American, Quincy Morris, and the dead vampire, Dracula, as if to ensure that, from now on, Englishness will become, rather than a purity of heritage and lineage or a symbol for national power, nothing more than a lost moment in Gothic history.